A billionaire CEO stood in the middle of her own company's lobby and offered $750,000 to anyone at all, who could calm her screaming little boy. Doctors had tried. Specialists flown in from 3 states had tried. A row of the most expensive child psychologists money could buy stood there helpless, while a 7-year-old boy sat on that marble floor, hands over his ears, screaming like the world was ending. Because for him, in that moment, it was. And then the maintenance man, the guy who fixes the elevators and mops the floors, the guy nobody in that building knows the name of, set down his toolbox and walked over and sat down on the cold marble next to that boy. Didn't touch him, didn't try to stop him, just sat. And after a few minutes he leaned in and he whispered one single word, and that screaming little boy went quiet. But before I tell you what the word was, and before I tell you why a janitor could do in 5 minutes what $1 million of experts couldn't do in an hour, let me say one thing to you. If you've ever loved somebody the world calls broken, and known in your bones that they aren't broken at all, just speaking a language nobody around them bothered to learn, then stay with me and subscribe, because this channel is for you and the ones you love. That's all I'll ask. Now, let me tell you about my own boy, because you can't understand that lobby without him. My name is Dale Brennan. I'm 45 years old, and I'm a maintenance man. I keep buildings running, the heating, the plumbing, the lights, the elevators, the 1,000 small broken things that nobody notices until they fail. It's invisible work. You only know I exist when something stops working, and I've made my peace with that, mostly because I learned a long time ago that being invisible isn't the same as being unimportant, and that some of the most important people in any building are the ones nobody can name. I'm a single dad, and to tell you this story right, I have to tell you about my son, because he is the reason I could do what I did, and he is the reason I'd have done it for free. My boy's name is Danny. He's 22 now, a grown man, but he wasn't always. And for the first long stretch of his life, Danny was nonverbal. Autistic, profoundly so when he was small. He didn't speak a word until he was nearly 9, and even now he speaks in his own careful, particular way. When Danny was little, the world looked at my son and saw a problem. Saw a kid who screamed in grocery stores, who couldn't be hugged some days, who lined his toys up in rows and melted down if you moved one, who covered his ears at sounds the rest of us couldn't even hear. The world saw something broken that needed fixing. I want to tell you what I saw, because it's the whole key to everything. I saw my son, a whole, complete, perfect person who happened to experience the world turned all the way up. Every light too bright, every sound too loud, every tag in every shirt like sandpaper, every change in routine like the ground giving way. Danny wasn't broken. Danny was overwhelmed, almost all the time, by a world built for people who aren't wired like him. And the screaming people called a tantrum wasn't him being bad. It was him drowning, and trying to tell us he was drowning, in the only language he had. It took me years to learn his language. Years. And Danny's mother, God rest her, she loved that boy with everything she had. But the weight of it, the sleepless years, the stares, the grief for the typical life we'd pictured, it wore her down. And she passed when Danny was 12, and it's been me and Danny ever since. I don't say a word against her, ever, and I won't here. Loving a child the world doesn't know how to love is a weight that 2 people can barely carry together, and she carried her half as long and as hard as she could. The stairs in the grocery store, the birthday parties he wasn't invited to, the well-meaning relatives who whispered that we were spoiling him or not disciplining him enough, the grief, and it is a grief nobody tells you that, for the ordinary life you'd quietly imagined before you knew. It wears on the strongest people. So when it was just me and Danny, I made a promise to the both of them, to her memory and to my boy, that I would learn him all the way down, no matter how long it took, so that at least one person on this earth would always understand him. That promise is the reason I know everything I know. I didn't learn it in a school. I learned it, keeping a promise. And in those years of learning my son, I became fluent in something most people never even know exists. I learned to read a nonverbal child. I learned that the screaming is information. I learned that you do not fix a meltdown by adding more noise, more touching, more calm down, buddy, more bright-faced strangers crowding in. You fix it by taking away, by getting low, by getting quiet, by becoming the one safe, still predictable thing in a world that's spinning too fast. I learned that the single most powerful thing you can do for a drowning child is not to grab him, but to get in the water beside him and stop thrashing, so he can see that the water isn't going to kill him after all. I learned, in other words, to be a calm place. It is the only real skill I have, and I paid for it with 20 years of my life, and I would not trade it for any diploma on any wall. I want to tell you one thing about those early years, so you understand it wasn't some gift I was born with. There was a night, Danny was maybe 5, when he'd been screaming for the better part of 2 hours, and I had tried everything I knew, which back then was nothing. And I'd done all the wrong things, the holding and the shushing and the, "Oh, please, buddy, please." And I had made it so much worse, and finally I just slid down the kitchen cabinets onto the floor and gave up. I stopped trying to fix him. I stopped trying to do anything at all. I just sat on the floor and went quiet because I was too exhausted to do anything else. And within a few minutes my boy crawled across the kitchen and pressed his back against my arm. Not a hug, he couldn't do hugs then, just his back against my arm. And he went quiet too. And I sat there on that floor at midnight and I cried, because I realized I'd been trying to pull him out of the water for 5 years, when all he'd ever needed was for me to stop thrashing and sit down in it with him. That's the night I started learning his language. It cost me my pride to learn it, which is maybe why it stuck. Every wrong thing I did first is exactly how I know the right thing now. So, the building. I do maintenance for a big corporate headquarters downtown, gleaming glass tower, the kind of place where the lobby alone cost more than every house on my street put together. And the company is run by a woman named Vivian Cole, CEO, founder, the whole empire hers. I'd seen her maybe twice in 2 years, the way you see the people at the top of a building like that, from a distance, briefly, never spoken to. To her, I was part of the building, the thing that keeps the lights on, furniture that walks. And I want to be clear, I'm not bitter about that, not even a little. It's just how those buildings work. There are people whose names are on the door, and people whose names are on a patch sewn to a gray shirt, and the second kind learn early not to expect the first kind to ever read the patch. I'd long since stopped minding. There's a strange freedom in being invisible, actually. You get to see everything, because nobody performs for the furniture. I knew which executives were kind to the cleaning staff and which ones weren't. I knew whose fancy office had a flask in the bottom drawer and whose had a child's drawing taped inside a cabinet where the clients couldn't see it. You learn a building's real heart by being the man nobody notices in it. And what I'd slowly learned about Vivian Cole, in 2 years of being furniture, was that behind the cold reputation in the empire, there was a closed door somewhere in her life that all her money couldn't open. What I didn't know about Vivian Cole, what almost nobody knew because she kept it fiercely private, was that she had a son, a little boy named Eli, 7 years old, and Eli was nonverbal. Autistic, exactly, almost uncannily, where my Danny had been 15 years before, when he was small. I learned all of this the way I learn most things, by being invisible in the room while important people talk like the maintenance man isn't there. I'd pieced together, over months, that Miss Cole had a child she rarely brought to the office, that she poured what must have been a fortune into therapies and specialists, that there was a whole private world of her life that had nothing to do with the empire and everything to do with the little boy she was fighting for. I felt for her, in a quiet way, the way you feel for someone walking a road you've already walked. But it wasn't my place to say anything, so I didn't. And then came the day. I don't know exactly what set Eli off. With a kid like that, Sometimes it's something huge, and sometimes it's a flickering light or a smell of cleaning solution or just too many days of holding it together. But I was up on the third floor fixing a door closer when I heard it. And I knew that sound. Lord, did I know that sound. The specific pitch of a nonverbal child in full overwhelm. Not a tantrum, not a brat being difficult, but a child in genuine pain, drowning, screaming, because screaming is the only word he has. I knew it in my spine before my brain caught up. I'd heard it 1,000 times from my own boy. I put down my screwdriver and I went toward it, because some instincts you can't override. By the time I got down to the lobby, it was chaos. Eli was on the floor, that big, beautiful marble floor, curled up with his hands clamped over his ears, screaming, his whole little body rigid with it. And around him, a disaster of good intentions. There must have been 6 adults crowded over him, 2 therapists, a doctor, Ms. Cole's assistant, and Vivian Cole herself on her knees, this powerful woman absolutely undone, reaching for her son, saying, "Eli, baby, please, please. What do you need? Tell Mommy what you need." And every single one of those people, with every loving, desperate, well-meaning thing they were doing, was making it worse. Because they were adding more voices, more hands reaching in, more bright, anxious faces crowding his space, more noise on top of a child who was already drowning in noise. They were trying to pull a drowning boy out of the water by all grabbing him at once, and they were holding him under without knowing it. And I want to be fair to them because they weren't bad people, and they weren't even bad at their jobs in the ordinary sense. They had credentials I'll never have. They cared. But every one of them had been trained to manage a behavior, to intervene, to do something, because doing nothing feels like failing, especially when a powerful, terrified mother is watching and the meter is running on their very expensive time. So they did, and did, and did, and every single thing they did was an input, a demand, a new thing for an already flooded little nervous system to process. A hand on the shoulder is information. A soothing voice is information. 6 concerned faces leaning in is a tidal wave of information to a child who is already past capacity. They were drowning him in help. And the cruelest part is they'd have kept doing it for another hour, with the best intentions in the world, because not one of them had ever learned the one thing my son taught me. That sometimes the most loving, most skillful, most powerful thing you can possibly do is nothing at all, done on purpose, with your whole attention. And here's the part you might not believe, but it's true. Somewhere in that hour, because it had been going on nearly an hour by the time I understood what I was seeing, somewhere in her desperation, Vivian Cole had said the thing that brought the whole strange day to its point. She'd looked up at the ring of useless experts and the gathering crowd, and she'd said, with the wild logic of a terrified parent who has tried everything money can buy, "I will give $750,000 to anyone in this building who can calm him down. Anyone. I mean it." A CEO's version of a scream, the only language her panic had left, money thrown at a wall, hoping something would stick. And of course, nothing did, because the one thing that child needed could not be bought, and the people qualified to give it weren't the ones she'd been paying. I stood at the edge of that crowd in my work clothes, with my name patch on my chest that none of them had ever read, and I watched for about 30 seconds. And I did the math that 20 years with Danny had taught me to do in an instant. The boy wasn't out of control. He was overwhelmed and surrounded, and every adult there was an input, and he needed inputs removed, not added. And I knew, not hoped, knew what would help, because I'd done it 10,000 times on a kitchen floor with my own son. So I did something a maintenance man is absolutely not supposed to do. I walked into the middle of all those important people, and I said quietly, but with enough certainty that they actually paused, "Everybody needs to step back. All the way back, right now, and stop talking." They looked at me like the furniture had spoken. The doctor started to object, but Vivian Cole, and I will respect her forever for this, looked at my face, and something in it, some recognition of a certainty she didn't have, made her say, "Do what he says." Everyone, step back. And they did. And then it was just me and a screaming little boy and a lot of suddenly empty space. I didn't go to him. That's the first thing you learn. You don't invade. I sat down on the marble a few feet away from Eli, not facing him directly, because direct is a threat when you're overwhelmed. I sat beside him, angled away, looking at the same patch of floor he was looking at. And I got quiet. Bone quiet. I made myself the stillest, most boring, most predictable object in that entire lobby. I didn't reach for him. I didn't say, calm down. I didn't say anything at all at first. I just became a calm place, the way I'd taught myself to be a calm place for Danny through 1,000 storms, and I waited. And I let the silence and the stillness do what noise and hands never could. I want to tell you how that feels from the inside, because it looks like nothing. And it is actually the hardest thing in the world. Every instinct in your body, when a child is screaming, is to do, to reach, to fix, to make it stop, because the sound of it goes straight through your chest. To sit still beside that and do nothing, to make your own breathing slow and your own face soft and your own hands quiet while everything in you is screaming to act, that takes everything you've got. It is not passivity, it is the most active stillness there is. You are holding a calm so steady that a drowning child can climb onto it like a raft. I'd built that raft for Danny 10,000 times. My body knew how to do it even when my heart was breaking, which it was, because that lobby floor was every midnight kitchen floor of my whole life come back at once. And slowly, not fast, these things are never fast, I felt the air change. The screaming started to come down, just a little, the way a boil comes off the heat. Because for the first time in an hour, the world had stopped adding things to him. One safe, still quiet thing had sat down nearby and asked nothing of him at all. Now, here's where the one word comes in, and I need you to understand it isn't magic, because everyone always wants it to be magic. It wasn't a magic word. There's no magic word. What there is, if you know how to look, is the one thing that particular child is reaching for underneath all the noise. Because as I sat there, getting quiet, I'd been watching Eli, not staring, just watching, the way you learn to watch. And I'd noticed that even in the depths of it, even screaming, one of his hands wasn't over his ear. One small hand was down on the marble, and the fingers were moving, tracing a shape over and over, the same motion, drawing something invisible on the floor. And I looked closer, and I realized I knew that shape, because Danny used to do something just like it. Eli was tracing a circle with little marks around it, over and over. And near him, fallen on the floor where it had been dropped in the chaos, was a small toy he must have been holding when it all started, a little toy sun, yellow with rays around it, a circle with marks around it. That boy, drowning in the worst moment of his week, was reaching for the one thing that was his comfort, his anchor, his safe thing, the sun. The toy he traced when the world got too big, and not one of the 6 experts crowded over him had seen it, because they were looking at the problem, not at the child. They were trying to stop a behavior. I was watching a little boy tell me, in the only language he had, exactly what he needed. That's the thing I wish I could put inside every person's head who's ever stood helpless over a child like this. The behavior is not the problem. The behavior is the message. A nonverbal child is not a silent child. He is communicating constantly, with his hands, his body, his eyes, the things he reaches for and the things he can't bear, the shapes he traces and the objects he clings to. He is talking all the time. The tragedy is almost never that the child can't communicate. The tragedy is that the people around him never learn to read. I learned to read on the only textbook that ever mattered, which was my own son's hands across 20 years. And so when I looked at Eli's hand tracing that shape on the marble, I wasn't guessing. I was reading. And the floor was telling me a story as plain as any printed page, if you only knew the alphabet. So I picked up that little toy sun off the marble, quietly, and I held it in my open palm where he could see it if he wanted to, not pushing it on him, just offering. And I leaned in just slightly toward that little boy, and I whispered the one word that I knew was the most important word in his whole world right then. I whispered, "Son." And Eli went still. His fingers stopped tracing. His head turned, just a fraction, toward the sound of a stranger who had, impossibly, said the name of his safe thing. And he saw the little toy son sitting in my open hand. And after a long, trembling moment, he reached out and took it, and pulled it to his chest, and held it, and the screaming stopped. Just stopped. The storm passed, because someone had finally spoken his language. Someone had finally looked at him and seen not a problem to be solved, but a little boy holding onto the sun. It's hard to describe what comes over a child in the moment the drowning stops, that shuddering, bone-deep exhale, the way the rigid little body softens all at once like a fist unclenching. I'd seen it on Danny's face 1,000 times, and it never stopped undoing me. That moment, when the world goes from unbearable to bearable, when a child realizes he's not alone in the water anymore. Eli did that. He shuddered and softened and held his son, and his breathing came down from those ragged gasps to something almost normal, and a tear ran down his face that wasn't a screaming tear anymore, just the leftover of a storm that had passed. And I sat very still beside him and let him have it, this small, hard-won peace, and I did not say another word, because the moment didn't need any more words. It had needed exactly one, and it had gotten it. The lobby was dead silent. 6 experts, a crowd of office workers, and Vivian Cole on her knees with both hands over her mouth, staring at a maintenance man sitting on the floor beside her calm son, who was quietly turning a little toy son over in his fingers like nothing had happened at all. I stayed down there on his level. I didn't get up and take a bow. I just stayed quiet and let him be calm, because the calm was new and fragile, and it was his, not mine, to interrupt. And after a while, when he was ready, when he was steady, I stood up slowly and stepped back and gave him his space, and I picked up my toolbox, because I had a door closer on the 3rd floor that still needed fixing. And Vivian Cole said, "Wait." Her voice was shaking. "Please, wait." She came over to me, this billionaire, in front of her whole company, and she could barely get the words out. She said, How did you do that? The best people in the country couldn't. How did you?" And I told her the truth. I said, "I didn't fix him, ma'am. There's nothing to fix. I just speak a little of his language, that's all. I've got a son. He's 22 now. When he was your boy's age, he was right where Eli is, nonverbal, overwhelmed by a world that's too loud for him. I spent 20 years learning to hear what my son couldn't say. So I knew what your boy was telling you. He was telling you the whole time, with his hand on the floor. He just needed somebody to be quiet enough to listen." And Vivian Cole, CEO of an empire, looked at the maintenance man she'd never once spoken to in 2 years, and she started to cry. Not the desperate crying from before, but something else, something like relief and shame and gratitude all at once. Because I think, in that moment, she understood that the answer she'd been throwing millions at had been walking around her building in a gray uniform the whole time, and she'd never seen him, because she'd never needed to. She told me later, much later, when we'd come to know each other a little, that the thing that broke her open on that floor wasn't even relief. It was a kind of terrible humility. She had spent a fortune and called in the most credentialed people in the country, and the thing that actually reached her son had come from a man whose name she'd never bothered to learn, who'd been in her building for 2 years, who she'd walked past 100 times. And she said it made her wonder, lying awake that night, how many other answers to how many other problems were standing quietly in gray uniforms all over her life, all over everyone's lives, unseen because we've decided in advance that wisdom wears a suit. She said it changed how she walked through her own company after that. She started reading the patches. She started learning names. A screaming child on a marble floor taught a billionaire to see the people she'd been looking through, and she never unlearned it. And then she remembered. The money. the $750,000 she'd offered to the whole building in her desperation. And she said, "The reward. I meant it. It's yours. My God, it's the least." And here's where I have to tell you what I did, because it's the only part of this that I think really matters. I said no. I want to be clear about why, because it isn't about being noble. I'm not a noble man. I'm a maintenance man with a grown son and a tired back. I said no because of Danny. Because 20 years ago, when my boy was screaming on a kitchen floor and I was learning his language one impossible day at a time, there was nobody to help me, and there was certainly nobody throwing me $750,000 to do it. I did it because he was my son, and you do not get paid to love your child. And the thing I did in that lobby, sitting beside Eli, was the same thing, the only thing. I loved a drowning child for a few minutes the way I'd learned to love my own. And you cannot take money for that. The second you take money for sitting beside a frightened child and speaking his language, you turn the purest thing a person can do into a transaction, and I would rather have stayed poor my whole life, which I mostly have, than do that to the memory of every hour I spent on the floor with Danny. And there was something else under it too, something harder to say. If I'd taken that money, then every parent on every kitchen floor for the rest of time could be told, somewhere in the back of their mind, that reaching your own child is a thing with a price tag, a service, a thing the rich can buy and the poor can't afford. And that's a lie, and it's a cruel one. The truth, the thing I needed that whole lobby to understand, is that what saved Eli wasn't expensive. It was free. It was just hard, and patient, and learnable, and available to anyone willing to get quiet and stop thrashing. I would not, let a check turn the most democratic kind of love there is into one more thing that only money can reach. So I gave the money back. Not because I'm above money, God knows I'm not, but because some things have to stay free or they stop being what they are. So I told her no. I told her to keep her money. But, and this is the part I'm proud of, I told her what to do with it instead. I said, "Miss Cole, you don't owe me a thing. But you've got more money than I'll ever see, and you've got a boy who's going to need a whole life of people who speak his language. So here's what you do. There are thousands of parents out there right now, on kitchen floors, learning their kids the hard way with no help and no money and no hope, the way I did. Build something for them. A center, a program. Someplace that teaches people to hear these kids, that gives families what nobody gave me. Spend your $750,000 on that. And spend 10 times that. And name it after your boy, so that everywhere he goes for the rest of his life, he knows the world finally learned his language. That's worth something." Me taking a check isn't, she just stared at me, and then she nodded, slowly, like something had clicked into place that would never click back out. I went back upstairs and I fixed the door closer. Now, I told you, this isn't a fairy tale, and it isn't, but the truth is better than one. Vivian Cole did it. She didn't just write a check and feel good about herself. She built the thing. Within a year, there was a center, a real one with her son's name on the door, that does exactly what I told her. It teaches parents and teachers and therapists how to actually hear nonverbal kids, how to stop adding and start listening, how to get in the water and be still. It's free for families who can't pay. It has helped, last I heard, hundreds of children and the exhausted, frightened, lonely parents who love them. Hundreds. Because a little boy traced his son on a marble floor, and somebody finally saw it. I went to see it once it opened, the center, and I'll be honest, I stood in the parking lot for a while before I could make myself go in, because I knew what it was going to do to me. Inside, there were rooms designed by people who finally understood. Soft lighting you could dim, quiet corners, spaces with nothing in them to overwhelm a flooded little mind, and staff being taught to get low and get quiet and listen instead of fix. There was a wall near the entrance where families could put up pictures of their kids, and it was already half full of these beautiful, particular children the world had called difficult, smiling in their own ways, and underneath someone had painted the words, "Not broken," just speaking a language worth learning. I had to go back out to the parking lot for a minute after I read that, because that was the whole thing I'd believed alone, on a kitchen floor, for 20 years, with nobody to say it back to me. And now it was painted on a wall where thousands of frightened parents would walk in and read it on the worst day of their lives and feel, maybe for the first time, that they weren't crazy and their child wasn't broken and there was a way through. And she did one more thing, quietly, that meant more to me than any check. She came and found me a few weeks later, and she asked if I would help. Not as a maintenance man, as someone who knew. She asked if I'd come, on my own time, paid fairly for my time like the expert I apparently am, and help train the people at that center, teach them what 20 years with Danny taught me. And that, I said yes to. Because that's not getting paid to love a child, that's getting paid to teach other people how, so more children get heard. There's a world of difference, and I think you know exactly what it is. I still do maintenance, I still keep the building running, the lights and the elevators and the 1,000 invisible things. But 2 evenings a week now, I sit in a bright room at the Eli Cole Center, and I teach young parents and eager therapists the only thing I really know, how to be a calm place. How to listen to a child who has no words. How to see the sun on the floor. I make a decent living. I'll never be rich, and I turned down $750,000 on a marble floor, and I have never once regretted it. Because what I got instead was the chance to make 20 years of the hardest love I ever gave count for something beyond my own kitchen. There's a version of that day where I take the check, and I'm comfortable, and a center never gets built, and hundreds of kids stay unheard, and I'm just a man who got lucky once. And there's no version where I take the check and also get to be the man who turned one boy's quiet moment into 1,000 other kids getting heard. The money would have fixed my back. It wouldn't have fixed anything that mattered. And anyway, here's the thing I've learned that the people throwing the money around mostly haven't. The love you give a child the world overlooks doesn't disappear when the child grows. It compounds. It goes out into the world and finds other children. Every hard hour I spent learning Danny, I thought I was spending it only on him. Turns out I was putting it in a bank I didn't know about, and 20 years later it paid out, all at once, on a marble floor, into a little boy named Eli, and from him into a center, and from that center into hundreds of kids I'll never meet. That's the secret nobody tells you about the hardest love. It is never wasted. It is never only for the one. It is the most patient investment there is, and it pays the whole world back. Eventually, in a currency money can't touch. That night, I drove home, and I called my Danny, who lives in his own apartment now with support, working a job he loves, sorting and organizing in a warehouse because his beautiful, particular brain makes him better at it than anyone. My nonverbal boy, who has words now, his own careful words, hard-won over 20 years. And I told him about Eli and the sun and the lobby, and Danny was quiet for a moment on the line, the way he is, and then he said, in his careful way, "You heard him." 2 words, and I had to pull over, because that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's everything I ever tried to do for Danny and for that little boy on the floor, and for every kid the world calls broken who isn't broken at all. You heard him. Yeah, buddy, I heard him. You taught me how. So let me ask you just one thing before you go. A room full of brilliant, expensive experts looked at a screaming child and saw a problem to solve, and one invisible man in a gray uniform looked at the same child and saw a little boy reaching for the sun, because he'd spent 20 years learning to see. So here's what I honestly want to know from you. Is there someone in your life the world calls difficult, or broken, or too much, who you've come to understand is just speaking a language most people never bothered to learn? Tell me about them down in the comments. Tell me their name. I read every single one, and I would be honored to know. And if this story reached you, if you believe, like I've come to believe with my whole heart, that nobody is broken, that some people are just waiting for one other person to learn their language, then do me that one favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet. Drop a like so the next person finds their way here, and leave your story in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's a good one.